So friends, most of you have picked up I'm Martyn. I'm part of the team here, and it's a delight to lead us this morning. And just conscious that at least 9 of you, I think, this morning we haven't met before this morning. So welcome to St John's Chatham, and it's just a delight to have visitors, as always, with us. Now, we're in this story about Jacob, and there's a lot in Old Testament terms, in terms of what names mean. And Jacob became a byword for one who deceives. Now, I don't think that was probably the case when Jacob was born, but it became, as people look back on his life, that's what he did most of his life. In parallel to this, many years ago, I worked in Zambia, and at that point, the Zambian football team at one point flew to Ghana for a football match. I think it was the African Nations League match, and there was a plane crash, and much of the Zambian football team died in that plane crash. And it became normal at that point, when you heard bad news, to say, "Oh, that's Ghana. That's really Ghana." That's as in, it's really bad. But that became a byword because they were flying to Ghana. That it became a byword for something that was really, really terrible. And I think Jacob, in a similar way, has become a byword in Hebrew for one who deceives, because of this is what his life was like. But let me tell you a bit more about Jacob. Let me give you the kind of the lowdown. Jacob was a twin. His older brother Esau obviously was born first. He was hairy. And Jacob came out basically doing a Superman pose, like that. I think that's how it happened anyway. But he came out grasping the heel of his older brother. And that's how Jacob was first named, because it literally translates as he grasps the heel. And so Jacob and Esau grew up in a household, and as sometimes happens, one of the boys grew up to be a bit like dad, and one of the boys grew up to be a bit like mum. And Esau is the one who grew up to be a bit like his dad, Isaac. He was one who liked wild game, and he went hunting. He was very much an outdoorsy kind of type, whereas Jacob was a bit more of a kind of tent guy, because they lived in tents in those days. He was a home guy. He kind of lived around home. He was quite happy to cook. He was just good at those kind of householdy things. And the two brothers kind of got along all right until Jacob basically blew it with his brother. So there are two particular incidents. One day, Esau came back from hunting, and he was really, really hungry, and he wanted some of Jacob's stew, lentil stew, by the way, at that. And Jacob said to him, "Okay, I'll give you some stew if you let me have your birthright." So birthright back then, the oldest son basically got all the inheritance, all the money, particularly if you're in a farming setting. You don't want to split up the estate across many, many different children. And so Esau said, "Well, what's the point of having a birthright? Because I'm going to die anyway if you don't give me some stew." So he sold his birthright for a pot of stew. And then, when their dad's getting a bit old, the dad says, "Okay, I want to bless my sons, and I want to bless my oldest son first, and with a different blessing to the blessing of my younger son." And so the dad, Isaac, suggests to Esau that he should go off and do some hunting and prepare some lovely wild game stew, like some venison stew or something, and then they'd meet in a few hours, and Isaac would bless his oldest son. But Jacob deceives his dad with his mum's help, makes some stew, puts on some goat's hair, so that he feels all hairy, just like his big brother was, because Esau was a hairy man and Jacob wasn't. And and he steals his brother's blessing from his dad. Now, for us, you kind of think, well, that's kind of a slightly weird thing, but that was a really big thing, to impersonate his big brother and to deceive his dad in that way. So much so that Esau swore to kill his brother. As soon as dad was died, he was going to go and kill his brother. And so Jacob is sent away to his mum's family in a different place. And long story short, Jacob manages to marry his cousin. Now, I know, you just don't do that these days. But anyway, his cousin Rachel, who was a shepherd, just like his mum had been a shepherd. So he married somebody in the image of his mum, which is an interesting sideline there. But Jacob himself is deceived by his uncle. Lots of deceit in this story of the history of Jacob, in that Jacob basically gets blind drunk on his wedding day. Anybody been there? Don't admit it in church, it's okay. Rachel, he was supposed to be marrying, Rachel's dad got Rachel's older sister dressed up as the bride, and Jacob didn't even notice until the next morning that he'd married the wrong girl. That's quite a bit of drinking, isn't it? Okay? And so then he because of, cultural norms back then, he ended up marrying the younger sister as well, and eventually he had 12 children by 4 different women. That's 11 boys, and then eventually a girl. Anybody else been there? Yeah. And eventually Jacob's uncle decides that enough is enough, and Jacob needs to go back to Esau's lands. Esau, his big brother, so he goes back to his brother's lands. And to be fair, Jacob is a bit worried about this. Remember, he fled because he stole his brother's birthright and his brother's blessing. He fled because he feared for his life. And so the bit of the story we've had, we're getting close to that now. Jacob basically has sent a messenger to his brother Esau to say, I'm coming home, just to let you know. And Esau has set out with 400 men to come and meet his brother. Now, it doesn't tell you that anything other than about these men, but I can imagine they are fighting age. They might well have weapons with them. And Jacob is bringing all of his stuff with him. So his goats and his camels and his donkeys and his wives and his children and the animals, young ones as well. And Jacob is afraid that his brother is basically going to annihilate them all. He even puts his children and his wives in kind of 2 different groups, going, well, if he attacks one group, then hopefully the other group will survive. And he sends them all across the border crossing, which is effectively the river, and then he spends all night on his uncle's land, but at the crossing point, at the turning point, facing up to his past deceit, facing up to the real prospect of 400 armed men descending on him. And it's at that point in Jacob's life that he wrestles with God, with God's angel, with a man. The story develops a bit, doesn't it? We think of her, first of all, see it as a man, but and then by the time it finishes, it feels like it's been God that he's been wrestling with. And he wrestles all night. Now, I wonder how often you are awake, wrestling, working over a particular problem. Do you actually take it to God? Do you wrestle it through anyway? But Jacob, after this wrestling match, ends up with 2 things: a new name and a new injury. So Jacob is renamed, no longer he who grasps the heel or the deceiver. he's renamed as Israel. The El, we are quite used to. We have El Elohim, El Shaddai, El this, El that. That's God in Hebrew. And the Israel, I'm told, probably means he struggles with. So meaning he struggles with God. And his injury is such that then Jacob, now known as Israel, limps as he leaves this encounter with God all night. I think there's two things to say here. One is that Jacob is considered to be one of the three patriarchs, the founding fathers of faith, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I think you could argue that Jacob is the most important of those three, given that he ended up with the biggest name change. Abraham became Abraham, Isaac stayed as Isaac pretty much, and Jacob became Israel. The other thing to say is that it was Jacob's, that is Israel's boys, who became the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel. So later in the Old Testament, when you read about Gad and Asher and Dan, those are the sons who became the leaders of the tribes of Israel. And of course, we talk about God's people as being the people of Israel. Yeah? And we, as followers of Jesus, are grafted into that same faith because of what happened with Jesus. So we are the people of he who struggles with God. And I think it's important that Jacob went from there limping. And to recognize that God uses people who struggle physically and who struggle spiritually, who are willing to face up to their history. We do not need to be perfect. In fact, sometimes perfection means, or near perfection, means that we are tempted to live in our own strength rather than God's. So Israel, Jacob, who had deceived, who had lied, been lied to, faced up to his past and was used by God on from there. And I just want to underline this again. We don't need to be perfect. God uses us in our imperfection, in our struggles. Whether we struggle to get out of bed because we're in so much pain, whether we struggle with some of the concepts about who God is, I think it's the struggling that really matters because we're trying to understand God. If we give up and walk away, that's not struggling, is it? But we are trying to discover and discern who this amazing God is. And we live in a world where it's really easy to listen to the world's critique and go, oh, there is no hope. But actually we need to keep Jesus at the center, don't we? We need to be recognizing that Jesus is the one who loves us and who cares for us. He knows all about us, and he still loves us. Now, for us today as a community, there's a clear parallel, isn't there, too, of Jacob turning to face his older brother after a period of separation and hurt. And I think there's lessons for us as a community here too. So for those of you who don't know the history of St. John's, Chatham, let me tell you a bit more, briefly, don't worry. This building was opened in 1821, and for many, many years was linked with St. Mary's, the one up next to Gun Wharf. By the 1990s, there was a good relationship with Emmaus, which is a United Reformed church just along the high street. If you go to McDonald's and go up the hill from there, you'll find it. And the decision was taken around about 1997 to move in together, so that the congregation from here moved to Emmaus, and by Palm Sunday or Easter Day or whatever it was, 1998, the two congregations were combined. And this building was then shut for 20-ish years and basically gently rotted away. But we'll focus on the congregations today. So from 1998 until 2018, for 20 years, those two congregations worshipped together and were in a formal partnership. The technical term is the local ecumenical partnership. And then officially the Anglicans left and said, thanks very much for the partnership of 20 years, but we're going back to reopen St. John's, Chatham. But none of the Emmaus congregation, none of those that had come from St. John's, apart from perhaps Mary, where are you? Not sure your history, sorry Mary, but nobody from Emmaus actually decided to take up the offer of joining with this new Anglican plant, this new Anglican outfit, despite those 20 years of partnership. And you can imagine the pain as the Anglican leadership withdrew and left the congregation to resource its own services and pastoral care and funerals and so on and so on. So now, like Jacob, we are going back. Jacob, who was in this passage going back to meet Esau, we are going back. So how might we, as it were, posture ourselves appropriately? By that I mean, what attitude do we go with next week? And I think we can learn from Jacob. One of the things that Jacob did to pacify his brother was that he put gifts of animals, and he sent them ahead of him. And he sent them with, he sent people, obviously, with the animals, with the cattle, the sheep, the goats, the whatever. And he gave them instructions to say this to them. He instructed the one in the lead, when my brother Esau meets you and asks, who do you belong to and where are you going and who owns all these animals? Then you're to say, they belong to your servant Jacob. Not to your brother Jacob, but they belong to your servant Jacob. And these are gifts sent by my Lord, to my Lord Esau, and he, Jacob, is coming behind us. So I think to say that we have come to serve is really helpful. I think there's another image that might be worth trying to think about a bit, is how you act when you go to grandma's house, or when you go to great-grandma's house, depending on your age at this point. Or go to any honoured relative's house. I don't know about you, but I am on good behaviour. I take my shoes off at the door. I don't put my feet up on the sofa. When I see dust and dirt, I don't criticise, but I feel compassion. I used to go back to see my mum and dad a bit, and, Mum wasn't very good at remembering to wear her glasses when she washed up, and sometimes you'd kind of look at things and you'd think, has that really been washed? And you wouldn't say anything to her, but you'd just gently go and wash it again, and and it would be clean and it would be all right. And so we don't critique, but we go with compassion that perhaps things are getting a bit much for Grandma. Certainly for me, when I went back to see my parents in latter years, you'd ask if you could make us some tea, and you might quietly do a bit of washing up and tidying while you're there, but we don't take advantage of our frailty. So I adapt my normal habits. And I think that might be a helpful image to think about. So we're joining with Emmaus for worship from next week. Realistically, that means apart from one family, that's us adding to a group of 10-ish people who are all over 60, perhaps even over 70. And we want to honour the Emmaus congregation as faithful servants of Christ. So if we sing a hymn occasionally, sing along, won't you? With the same gusto as we do for other songs. Things will be a bit different. There's padded chairs there to start with, which will be a joy to some of us. But let's go with that desire to serve, to honor, to love, rather than critique. And I think the bigger change is probably for them. Today there are 10 to 12 people singing to pre-recorded songs, using a printed order of service with the words of the songs on. Next week, there'll be all us there. Just look around, see how many of us there are. We'll have musicians, we'll have live worship. There'll be more chairs out. There'll be lots of people you guys that know each other, and then this group of people that are used to the building, but they won't know any of you, or pretty much any of you. And that's, I think, quite daunting and an amazing piece of God's grace at work, that we've even been invited to worship with Emmaus. We first of all talked about this at a church council level, and there was an encouragement to think, yes, let's talk, let's ask, but let's ask whether we could worship in the building. And the response came back, well, why don't you worship with us? And so we go at their invitation, and with a tremendous, I think, sense of excitement, but we need to recognize that we are worshiping in their space, and we are welcome guests. So let's reach out, let's love, let's show compassion, let's get to know this radical group that have offered us, again, a shelter, a place to worship and grow, and we go with thankful hearts. Now, I need to finish, but I don't want to leave you hanging. We had Jacob limping, renamed, having faced off with God all night and was still alive, but with his flocks, with his children, with his family, and Esau and his 400 men coming over the hill to see them. Let's see how it ended. Thankfully, it ended well. This is chapter 33, and I think Roger might even have it on the script, on the system for us. Jacob looked up. Follows directly from our previous passage. Jacob looked up, and there was Esau coming with his 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 female servants. He put the female servants and their children in front, Leah and her children next, and then Rachel and Joseph in the rear. He himself went on ahead and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. But Esau, the big brother, ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him. So that's all Esau's initiation. Esau ran, Esau embraced him, Esau threw his arms around Jacob, around his neck and kissed him, and then they wept. Then Jacob looked up and saw the women and the children and said, well, who are all these guys with you? Because this is family that he'd not met before. And there may well be tears as we meet, but God is in this, friends. When we first talked about, so Esau looked up and saw this family he'd never met, and introductions happened. And I think we too need to go and introduce ourselves. We need to be willing to recognize that we are part of the same family of followers of Jesus, but we haven't seen each other for a while. And my, haven't we grown in number? Praise God, and may He continue to draw people into this newly combined community in these next weeks and months. For that's our continued prayer, is that God will add to his number daily, weekly, monthly. So if you're new, journey with us, please. If you've been with us some time, of course, journey with us, please. We long to see you on the other side next week.